The film has the most attractive cast to have ever graced our screens. Like, you must not read from the book. You can read from the book. Generally, I just love Brendan Fraser anyway. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, I'm Kelsey. I'm the creator of Bite Size Ancient History and now an official graduate of Cambridge University. If you're not new here and you're one of my original followers, you may be wondering where I've been. So, as I just said, I've just graduated, so the latter half of my masters at Cambridge was a little bit more intense than the first half, so I just didn't really have time to do the extra YouTube videos whilst running the Instagram and TikTok. However, I will now be uploading weekly videos. So don't forget to give this video a like if you like it and subscribe. And don't forget to check out all of my other socials for all of your favourite and fun historical content. So if you've come over to this video and followed me because of my TikTok account, you will know just how much I love the 1999 Mummy film. Like, it is what made me who I am today. It's one of my absolute favourites. And by popular request, I'm going to be talking about the historical facts, historical fiction, and the inspiration behind a lot of the plot of the film. It goes without saying that when you make a historical film, there's going to be a lot of historians that will rip into it and criticise it, and I am not here to do that. As I said, it's one of my favourite films, and I think it's actually really good at finding this perfect balance between the historical fact and obviously the fiction that make it a good and interesting movie. Because if you just make a completely historically factual film, it's not going to be that interesting to most people watching it. We as historians may love it, potentially, but I think most of the public are going to get a little bit bored. I'm going to try my best to work through the film in chronological order. Obviously, it is quite a long film with a lot of historical details, so if there's something that I missed that you really want me to talk about, just comment it down below. The film starts in ancient Thebes in 1290 BCE with our main antagonist, Imhotep. I'm excited to say that Thebes is a very real place. During ancient Egypt, it was one of the nomes in Upper Egypt, which if you look at the map is just down and around here. The film depicts it as a very important and influential city, often being home to the pharaoh Seti I. And this again is very accurate. It often served as a royal city throughout Egypt's history, especially during the New Kingdom when this is set. The film also refers to it as the City of the Living. And this is kind of true. So basically you have the city of Thebes over on the east bank, which is where people would have lived, and then over on the west bank of the Nile you had the necropolis, which they actually called the City of the Dead. And what I think the film has done here is just used it to give a name to this area of Thebes. Obviously in the film the City of the Dead has its own name, Hamunaptra, which I will get to in a second. So, as I said, it starts in 1290 BCE with Seti I as the reigning pharaoh, and this is kind of true. 1290 is when he actually first came to power. He doesn't die for many years later, so obviously the film took a little bit of liberty there because we see him being killed by Imhotep. Finally, regarding Thebes, I think it's quite important to talk about the way they made the city look, because we do not have the archaeological remains today in that area to say that it actually looked like that. But what the artistic designers have done is quite clever, because they've pulled on different inspirations from varying sites within Thebes, such as Karnak and Luxor. So as you can see, they've kind of taken inspiration with the columns from those that are in Karnak and a lot of other ancient Egyptian sites. Then in the film we have these giant statues of Anubis, which you could argue are kind of similar to the colossi of Memnon that we also find in Thebes, and many other large statues. Finally, the gateway there is a very common ancient Egyptian archaeological feature. So what they've done is created a fictional city out of very real artistic and architectural elements. Finally, Hamunaptra. This plays a very important role within the film, with Evie and her brother Jonathan finding the map that will lead them to the location that has been hidden and secret for years. Unfortunately, it is not real. in the slightest. I can kind of see what they were doing because, as I was talking about earlier, within Thebes there was this idea of the city of the dead where the necropolis lies, which is obviously where they go to. They go to the burial of all these pharaohs with their wealth. But it wasn't called Hamunaptra. I guess they've just tried to create a name for it and get a little bit further from historical fact so that they can be a little bit more liberal with their decisions. One thing that they talk about in the film as well is the fact that it's this mythical hidden location where Seti I buried and disguised all of his riches and treasures as one of the wealthiest pharaohs in ancient Egypt. Again, it's not really in any historical records. You could argue they've just tried to Hollywoodize the idea that when a pharaoh died, they would put a lot of their wealth into their burial. For example, I think a lot of you will have seen Tutankhamun's tomb, which was absolutely stocked full up to the ceiling with rich treasures of gold and gems and jewellery. And I guess it's kind of a hint towards that, but just made it sound a little bit more exciting. As an interesting side fact, it also wasn't filmed on any kind of Egyptian site. This was completely constructed out of set material in Marrakesh. Imhotep was actually a very real historical figure. However, the way that they portray him in the film couldn't be any further from historical fact. And if you recognise this image, you will actually know some of Imhotep's best work. Aside from the 1999 Mummy film, obviously. He was a real elite that lived during the Old Kingdom of Egyptian history. And if you're not familiar with the general timeline of Egyptian history, don't worry at all. The Old Kingdom is one of the earliest periods, whereas the New Kingdom, where this film is set with Seti I and Imhotep, is way further into the future. Real Imhotep was actually the chancellor and architect of the pharaoh Djoser, who constructed these pyramids. Interestingly enough, they did both serve as high priests. However, the real Imhotep was the high priest of Ra, whereas the Imhotep in our film served as the high priest of Osiris. I guess this change was just to make it seem a little bit more darker, because obviously Osiris has the connotations to death and the afterlife, so it makes Imhotep just seem that little bit more evil and crazy. Little is known aside from this about the historical figure of Imhotep himself. However, we do know that around 3,000 years later that he was worshipped and deified by the Egyptian population. He was actually equated to the original Egyptian god Thoth, who was in charge of writing, intellect, maths and architecture. Let's talk about Seti I. So as we said, the time period is actually quite accurate to his general era of reign. And the other feature that they really focus on when talking about Seti I is the idea that he was the richest pharaoh to have ever lived, and that's why it's so exciting that we're finding Hamunaptra where he hid all of his treasures. Unfortunately, when it comes to Egyptian economy, it's a very difficult topic to discuss. Within our economy today, we obviously have a monetary system which is regulated and normal for us to understand and track to see how there's inflation and decline. However, in ancient Egypt, there wasn't an official monetary system put in place until they were later invaded by the Greco-Romans. So, what does this mean when we're talking about Egyptian economy? They did have a kind of economic system, but it was more of a barter system and a trade system, so it's very hard to talk about who had money and who didn't. However, we know that Seti I was a very, very successful pharaoh, and he lived during a very prosperous period where Egypt was successfully re-establishing its control after a period of decline in the Amarna era, which I can do another video on if you're interested. Seti I also famously set up new mines and quarries in the Sinai region, which meant he brought a lot of gems and jewels again into the Egyptian economic system. So this is obviously going to bring him some amount of wealth. Considering this, he may have been Egypt's richest pharaoh. Equally, it could be his son, who continued on these successes. But we can't say definitively that he was the richest pharaoh to have ever lived, but he was pretty well off. So there's one other main historical character that we need to talk about, and that is Anck-Su-Namun. She is famously the concubine to Seti I within the film. I am excited to tell you that she was a real historical figure. However, again, like Imhotep, it's not quite true to her real life. She was actually a real queen that lived in the Amarna period, which I just mentioned earlier. She was actually the daughter of Akhenaten and eventually went on to marry Tutankhamun, a name I'm sure you're very familiar with. Just as a side fact, it's one of those relationships that ancient Egypt was famous for, because we think they may have been half-siblings or cousins. Pretty grim. Let's talk briefly about the costumes. Imhotep's costume actually is pretty historically accurate. Generally, the priests were only allowed to wear white while they were working and serving as a priest. However, most priests were actually elite men who could get away with wearing outfits like we see with Imhotep. Obviously, it's not quite as glamorized and glitzy as they show in the film, but the pleated skirt that he wears is pretty accurate, and his necklace, again, you can see a lot of similarities with those that we found in burials. Anck-Su-Namun's costume, or lack of costume. Obviously, she was a concubine, which, if you know what that word means, it kind of makes sense that she doesn't have a lot of clothes. And when we find ancient Egyptian dolls, which we've kind of interpreted to be those of concubines, they're also not depicted wearing a lot of clothes. If not completely naked, you have the one that I'm showing down here, where you have a kind of shell effect or dress or skirt at the bottom. We've then also found these actual dresses in tombs, so we know this was something people were wearing. But were they wearing this elaborate body paint kind of situation that we have in the Mummy film? It's very hard to find an exact parallel to kind of say where they've got their inspiration from. However, if you look at the doll again, you can argue that the way that they've painted on the seashells on the lower half of the doll, they've interpreted it as body paint with some artistic license. The pattern of the body paint, again, is also quite similar to the dresses that we've found. So I guess it's another Hollywood version of the historical reality. Seti I, how accurate is his costume? Generally, it's pretty close. So the crown that he's wearing is a very real crown. We haven't found any archaeological or material evidence of this, however, we have a lot of depictions of this crown. This is Deseret Red Crown of Lower Egypt. See from the picture here, it's very accurate. They both have the uraeus and the similar kind of shape at the back of the head. The Eye of Horus necklace that you see here, very real. We have many examples of that, again, most famously from Tutankhamun's tomb, and the beard was a very real thing and a power symbol of the ancient Egyptian pharaohs. Okay, so that is the historical figures done and out of the way. Now to the exciting parts of the plot. So we know that after this illicit affair between Anck-Su-Namun and Imhotep, that he receives a kind of punishment, especially after he tries to resurrect her. And this is a curse called the Hom-Dai. This curse involves the victim having his tongue cut out and then being mummified and buried alive with scarab beetles. We're then told that if he's ever resurrected, that the 10 plagues of Egypt will follow him. So, are there any parallels to this? If you're a budding archaeologist or Egyptologist, you will often hear of curses. Again, especially in relation to the famous tomb of Tutankhamun, as when excavated by the Carnarvons and their team, there was a series of mysterious deaths following it. And what's interesting about this example is that we have no evidence within Tutankhamun's tomb of any curse even being written. So this was really just the media trying to create attention and drive a story. We do, however, have very rare instances of curses appearing on tomb walls. For example, in the 6th century, we have one that kind of warns the priests who are in charge of this burial to look after it and make sure that it is nurtured in its afterlife. So, long story short, the Hom-Dai curse did not exist, unfortunately. And that kind of makes sense, because the more you actually think about the curse used in that film, it makes very little sense. Because if it was somebody that was evil and you didn't trust, why would you potentially give them all of this power with the 10 plagues of Egypt? I have no idea. It's weird, but we enjoy it anyway. But the tongue being cut out as part of the curse actually does have some historical fact, as it was a very rare punishment used in ancient Egypt and other ancient societies. Now on to the more contemporary characters and our main protagonists, Evie and Rick. I'm going to talk about Evie first just because she was a major role model for me growing up, obviously because I'm here. And I think the way that they depict her character, especially in relationship to the others, which are men, is a very clever way of highlighting the real issue within the archaeological world at the time. When we first meet her and her brother Jonathan, it's very clear that Evie is the smart one, who has always worked hard and has just a lot more archaeological knowledge than Jonathan, who comes in like a kind of blundering idiot that doesn't really know what he's doing. Despite this, he's the one that occasionally gets to go out on digs, and Evie is continually rejected because she doesn't have enough experience. And obviously we go into this cycle of how can you get experience if you're not letting me do it? And this was a very real issue, that women in archaeology were often just completely overlooked. Basically, whatever the women did in archaeology, they had to do 100 times better to receive even 1% of the recognition that a man would. And there's just so much you could say and talk about on this topic, and if it's something you're interested in, please do your own reading or let me know if you want another video in detail, because I feel very passionate about it obviously and I love talking about it, but it will not fit in this video today. So what I am going to do is link down below the TikTok where I did a little 1-minute summary on this issue. I think one of the main themes that also emerge with these contemporary characters is the archaeological methods that were being used in this period of time, because it's very questionable. We often see them, well, they have no method actually half the time, and they have one goal really for what they want out of that dig. Anything small that could give them information that may not look as pretty is completely destroyed and pushed aside. And unfortunately, this is an accurate depiction of archaeological studies at this time. I think one of the best stories that can exemplify this is a slightly earlier example from the late 1800s with a man called Schliemann, who, with his Homer's Iliad, decided he was going to find the ancient site of Troy. And rather than digging and looking for the material with any kind of method, he already had this preconceived idea of what Troy would look like. And the result of this is that he dug through the actual layer of Troy. He destroyed Troy and found an earlier site because he was so blinded by what he thought it was going to be and ignored any other finds because he just wanted that one thing. I think that best shows the lack of methods in this time period. So unfortunately, the film gets that bit very accurate. Another thing that we see happening in this film is a lot of booby traps, and this is a common theme in any kind of Hollywoodized historical film. For example, we see the other excavators team opening up where the Canopic Jars are stored, and you have salt acid coming out and spraying the workers. Alongside this, we have all of these kind of moving doors and trap doors. In the sense that we see booby traps in the film, they did not really exist. At least not to the level that we see films depicting it. There is a kind of precursor where you can see that they've been inspired. So we've actually found evidence of stone portcullises, which when the creators of the tomb and the priests finally left the area, they would lower this behind the doors to just act as a further prevention to stop tomb robberies. We also find a lot of shafts and pits within our more elaborate burials. I should also say that the burials that we see in ancient Egypt is not the way that everybody was buried. This is the very, very top elite people. Most peoples would have just been simply buried in a hole in the ground, unfortunately. But with these elite burials, we do find these shafts and these pits. However, we kind of think that they have a more symbolic and religious meaning, which allowed their soul or their ba to escape after the deceased was passing on into the afterlife, rather than with the aim of trapping anybody. Eventually, when they did get more concerned with tomb robbery, as it became a major issue because we found tombs that they weren't even broken into. The priests themselves who were working in the tomb were stealing things on their way out. There were obviously other tomb robberies at the time and then later in the future. And during the 18th dynasty, we actually have the group called the Medjai, which will sound familiar if you know the film. And this was an ethnic group from Nubia, and they acted as a special police force within ancient Egypt. And one of their jobs was to prevent tomb robberies and to protect the burials of the pharaohs, which I think is a quite cool and accurate detail that they pick up on in the film with their own Medjai, who were there to protect the burial of Imhotep. Obviously they say it's to stop the curse, but there is a little bit of fact there, so that's quite cool. Another cool embellishment within the film is the fact that in the backgrounds of a lot of the scenes, you see very real ancient Egyptian art. Obviously not the actual thing, but copies of a very real piece. For example, in this scene, you see a very real wall art from the Amarna period. And I think that's just another cool little detail which, for me, I think it keeps historians happy because we see that they have actually done some level of research to produce this story. Another thing that's really cool for Egyptologists like me is the fact that they actually include some real hieroglyphs. For example, with the character Ardif Bey, you will have noticed he has tattoos on his face. And these can actually be translated. So on his forehead it says Imhet, and this basically means underworld or netherworld. And then on his cheeks it's Ma'at, and this means justified, and it's often a word that accompanies the name of the deceased. So it's really in keeping with this theme of him being the protector of these tombs and the afterlife. And I just think that's really cool. I think personally what this film is really good at is just getting the occasional small detail that comes from actual Egyptian history, because it's just really satisfying to work it out and realise, oh, that's where they got that from. That makes sense. For example, we know that they find the books under the base of statues. She finds the Book of the Dead under the statue of Anubis. This idea of finding books under the statues of Egyptian deities is a very real thing. Archaeologists in the modern day haven't personally found it, but stories made in ancient Egypt describe these ancient texts being found under statues. For example, chapter 30 of the Book of the Dead was actually discovered under the statue of Thoth. Whether this is true or not, it's still taking inspiration from ancient Egyptian mythology, and I just think that's another cool little detail. So I think it's about time that we talk about the Book of the Dead. I think we're at about that stage in the film where they finally find it. And the Book of the Dead is real. I can tell you that, and that's good. That's exciting. It's another fact that they've got right. But not in the way that we see it in the film. So obviously we see this beautiful, complete, bound book, which isn't quite what the Book of the Dead is, which, I mean, the name itself is misleading, don't get me wrong, but the Book of the Dead isn't a book. It is a collection of ancient burial texts. There was never one complete book form of it. We have just, in a sense, created our own book from all of those that we have found. Unfortunately, you cannot have everything you've ever wanted, because the Book of Amun-Ra is not a real thing. There's not really any precursors in ancient Egyptian history that can even bring us to the conclusion of the Book of Amun-Ra. It's just something the creators had to invent completely to try and find a solution to the plot they had devised. Obviously in the film we use the Book of Amun-Ra to kill the deceased and send them back to the afterlife, and it is the Book of the Dead which resurrects people. With the Book of the Dead, it kind of does resurrect people, not in the sense of we actually have mummies walking around your towns and cities, but it was actually a helpful and magical text designed to aid the deceased on their journey to the afterlife. Because on their way they'd have to actually come across many different tasks and horrible, weird creatures, and this text was kind of a help guide, and it would in a sense help them be resurrected, but into the afterlife, not into the real world. Along with the Book of the Dead, they obviously find the Canopic Jars, and these are a very real thing. Very, very factually correct within the film. Just a few little details that they decided to tweak. I guess they kind of had to. So the main thing is that in the film there are 5 Canopic Jars. In real life there are 4. And there's 4 deities that it kind of aligns to, and it's the idea of protecting all cardinal directions in a box. So it makes sense. In the film they had 5 because they had 5 characters which needed to take one and be killed by Imhotep. So I get why they had to do that. That makes complete sense. We have this idea of the 10 plagues of Egypt, which we find in the Book of Exodus. And the film accurately depicts most of these plagues. It does not include them all, and I cannot remember them all in order off the top of my head. So I'm going to leave them in a list here for you to read slowly. Cool. But yeah, we see the water into blood scene, we see the fire raining down, we see the locusts, and yeah, that all is in the Book of the Exodus. Again, no historical fact there. It could have escaped archaeological record, but again, something like that, we would expect to see something, and there isn't anything. Next, when Evie and Rick encounter Imhotep, they have a cat in their hotel room, and this somehow scares Imhotep away, and we're told that they are the protectors of the underworld. This isn't really true, and I get why they did it, because you find a lot of cats in Egypt, so it's useful to use it, and cats were in a sense worshipped in ancient Egypt. They played a role within their pantheon because you have the goddess Bastet, or Bast, however you want to pronounce it and write it. But she wasn't really associated with being the protector of the underworld. In some texts we see her being the wife of Anubis, who played a much larger role within the afterlife, so I can kind of get that. She does actually also occur in the Book of the Dead, and this is when the deceased has their heart measured against the feather of Ma'at to see if they'd lived a true and good life, and she kind of acts as the protector during this scene to see if they should or should not gain entry. More generally, she also acts as a protector goddess, as we've seen in some spells, but not really protector of the underworld. But I get why they did it in the film. It makes sense, and it has its roots and inspirations in historical fact. Finally, as we get towards the end of the film, we have our final battle scene with Imhotep and Evie and Rick and Jonathan, and we see him use a spell which brings the wall paintings to life. They come out as mummies. And it seems ridiculous, but this does have real inspiration, because the ancient Egyptians, when they created wall art and inscriptions, they very much believed that that created life within the tomb. And I think that is all we're going to have time for today. This is going to be a really long video, so I'm going to see what I can do when I'm editing it down, but I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if there's any other parts that I missed from the film that you want me to cover down in the comments below. Also, if there's any other historical films you want me to talk about, because it means I get to watch movies and consider it as work, so that's great for me. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out my other socials for all my fun historical content. I'll see you next week. Bye!